This lecture is on Vietnam, Nixon, and impeachment. Full disclosure, I'm making this recording at home, so in the background you may hear various alarms going off, you may hear children playing, you may hear dogs barking and doorbells ringing. Just roll with it. We have 5 objectives for this lecture. First, we will analyze the causes of the war in Vietnam and American goals in the war. Then we'll analyze American conduct and strategy in the Vietnam War. Third, we'll discuss how and why the Vietnam War ends. Fourth, we'll analyze politics in the 1970s. And finally, fifth, we'll compare and contrast Watergate to the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. Let's begin with a brief history of Vietnam. Prior to the Vietnam War, Vietnam was a French colony, and it was called French Indochina. French Indochina consisted of the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Now, historically, sometimes Vietnam had been independent and sometimes it had not. It just kind of depended on the time and the place. But before World War II, this belonged to the French. Now, during World War II, the Japanese are going to invade French Indochina. And this is going to reinvigorate an already existing nationalist movement within Vietnam. And so the Vietnamese will be fighting the Japanese, trying to remove them from what was then French Indochina, trying to gain independence. America will be assisting them in this, but once the war ends, kind of all bets are off. And so, following World War II, Europe's economy is kind of a wreck, especially the French, who remember had been invaded and fell very early on in the war, and they were occupied by the Germans for most of the war. And everyone is kind of looking to rebuild. So the French make the argument that they needed revenue from their colonial empire to, number one, help them rebuild their economy, and number two, to help them begin to rearm, because as we know, the Cold War is heating up, and the United States desperately wants France to begin to rearm to help maintain its own defense. On the other side of this equation, of course, are the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese very much want independence. And so that's how we're getting things set up in the late 1940s, early 1950s. The leader of the Vietnamese nationalist movement in World War II and immediately thereafter is a man named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho is his last name, Minh is his first name. Usually Asian names, last names go first and first names go last. But in this lecture, sometimes I'll do it either way. I'll let you know how I'm doing it, depending on how you'll see it more commonly in American media sources. There's an alarm, warned you. Anyways, so Ho Chi Minh is a communist, but first and foremost, he is a nationalist. And the group that he leads are called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh characterize themselves as guerrilla freedom fighters, and they were the ones that were attacking the Japanese during World War II, and then following World War II, they turned their attentions on the French, whom they view as imperialists. And the French are imperialists, right? They've colonized Vietnam. And remember, during World War II, the Viet Minh is backed by the United States. The United States grants them lots of aid. Our Office of Strategic Services, the kind of forerunner to the CIA, the OSS, is operating in Vietnam. And immediately following the Japanese collapse in World War II, Ho Chi Minh gets up and he makes this big speech and he quotes the Declaration of Independence and he petitions, Truman for independence and for help. And so it's kind of one of these, historical what ifs, right? Because again, Ho Chi Minh is a communist, but He was a nationalist first, and it's one of those historical what if America said, we'll back your independence if you don't be communist? Does history change? Does the Vietnam War happen? Does Vietnam go communist? Who knows, right? But it's an interesting question. In any event, looking at this realistically, who is it that the United States is probably going to back? Our literally longest ally, the French, who's been with us since the American Revolution, or a bunch of ragtag guerrilla fighters? Obviously, the United States is going to back its ally France over the Viet Minh. And so, what then follows from 1950 to roughly 1954 is a war in Vietnam, with the French trying to re-establish control over their colony and the Viet Minh attempting to dislodge the French. Now, Eisenhower, who is president during this time period, certainly does not want Vietnam to go communist, but the one thing Eisenhower consistently feared was a ground war in Asia. And Eisenhower would know. Remember, he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He was the general that won World War II in Europe. So he knows what war looks like and how messy it can get. And so, while the United States does help France, and in fact pays for up to about 80% of the expenses of France's war in Vietnam, the United States refuses to engage ground troops into Vietnam at this point. So the French are going to run into the problem that America later runs into, and that is that they have a very hard time finding the enemy. Remember, the Viet Minh are largely guerrilla fighters, meaning that they're not a regular army wearing a uniform, marching in formation. They're using guerrilla tactics, so they look like civilians. They're going to be doing hit and run. They're doing sabotage. They're doing what we'd call today terrorism against French forces. And so the French are kind of fed up, and they decide to try to lure the Viet Minh out into the open, to kind of have a one big battle where they could finish off the Viet Minh once and for all. And to do that, they gathered at a place called Dien Bien Phu in 1953 with the idea of luring the Viet Minh to attack them. And the thinking going that, once they see where the Viet Minh are, then they can destroy them and win. Now, the Dien Bien Phu, you can see the picture there, is actually in a valley. And the French were thinking that this would be great because they would trap the Viet Minh in there. There wouldn't be a place for them to retreat. So you could kind of kill them all. What they weren't counting on was the widespread support that the countryside had for the Viet Minh. Your average Vietnamese person living in the countryside is supporting the Viet Minh over the French. And so what you had was kind of this amazing grassroots aid to the Viet Minh, where you had peasants literally hand dragging heavy artillery up the mountain. And so what ended up happening was the Viet Minh were able to take the high ground and just kind of rain death down upon the French. And the French end up having to surrender. With the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1953, this is pretty much the end of French forces in Vietnam. And so now from this point, the French kind of kick the issue of Vietnam over to an international meeting that's already going on. It's called the Geneva Convention in 1954. So back to Eisenhower. Remember, Eisenhower is now president. He was a general in World War II, the general in World War II in Europe. He knows what this looks like. And so he did not want to have to take direct action against the Viet Minh in Vietnam. He is following a type of containment called asymmetrical response. In other words, part of asymmetrical response is pitting U.S. strengths against communist weaknesses. And he does believe in the domino theory. The domino theory being that if one country falls to communism, then its neighboring country will fall, and then its neighboring country will fall like a row of dominoes toppling over. And he does kind of buy into this, and he doesn't think that Vietnam going communist is good. But he does recognize that Vietnam really is a peripheral area to the United States. And this is very much in line with asymmetrical containment. France is a vital area to the United States. No way, under any circumstances, can France go communist. That would be catastrophic for U.S. national security. But Vietnam? Meh. Most Americans can't even find it on the map, right? So while it's not good for Vietnam to go communist, does it really matter? And to Eisenhower, not enough to engage in direct action. That being said, America does start to step in to help the Vietnamese government stave off the communist Viet Minh's advances. And the main way that we're doing this at this point was through military and political advisors, as well as continuing to send military aid. That being said, the numbers are very, very small. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, they do work out a plan for what will happen to Vietnam following the French exit. The first thing that they did was that they divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In the north, the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh would be in charge. And because Ho Chi Minh is a communist, that means North Vietnam was also communist. And in the south, there was a pro-Western, U.S.-backed government established. In theory, this division is supposed to be temporary. In 1956, there are supposed to be nationwide elections wherein Vietnam will vote which way they want to go and how they want to be governed. So after the French depart, as I stated, America steps in to begin filling the gap. And the government that America is going to install in the South is going to be led by a man named Nguyen Dinh Diem. Diem in this case is his last name. A lot of the time in American media during this time period, like this cover of Time, you can see that they're going to be putting his name, American style rather than Asian style. So that's how we're using it here. Anyways, Diem is originally from central Vietnam, but he was Western educated and he is also Catholic. And with the help of the American CIA, when Diem comes in, he is going to ruthlessly suppress a lot of the factionalism that we saw in the South. Basically, anyone that was undermining his rule or challenging his authority will be arrested or in some cases assassinated. And again, the United States is helping him do this. Now, you can kind of see the argument for this in the beginning, maybe, but keep in mind that this continues throughout American involvement. This doesn't actually stop. And so you have to kind of question to yourself, okay, how democratic, how free is South Vietnam? If you oppose the government, you will end up executed. Also with American support, Diem is going to refuse to call the mandated elections in 1956. And the reason why Diem refused to hold those elections was because he knew that Ho Chi Minh would win overwhelmingly. Ho Chi Minh was enormously popular in the north, and he also had a lot of support in the south, especially in the countryside. And so both Diem and the United States knew that if these elections were held, the country would be unified under Ho Chi Minh and it would become communist. By this time, South Vietnam was the second largest American military aid recipient, second only to Korea, which, remember, just got done fighting a war, right? Now, initially, Diem enjoyed significant success in rooting up suspected supporters of Ho Chi Minh in the north. And so in theory, at that point, once he enjoyed that success, you would have hoped he backed off. But instead, noticing how effective this method was, he began to double down. And he began to round up not just Northern sympathizers, but anybody suspected of being Northern sympathizers, family members of Northern sympathizers, anybody who was critical of him. And so, unsurprisingly, that's going to make people not like him and not like his regime. And so, in reaction to Diem's redoubled efforts, we're going to begin to see the North Vietnam, begin its infiltration efforts into the South. And so what we will see then form in South Vietnam is something called the National Liberation Front, the NLF. The American nickname for this group was the Viet Cong. This is a southern insurgency. So these are South Vietnamese citizens who want to overthrow the Diem regime and, reunite with the North. So they are allied with Ho Chi Minh. And they will be targeting Southern government officials in what today we would call a terrorist campaign. They would, assassinate leaders, kill families, this kind of thing. And if you were to ask them, they claimed that they were dedicated to overthrowing Diem's, quote, puppet regime. From their point of view, they are the freedom fighters. From the American and South Vietnamese government point of view, they were the enemy. They were terrorists. Within a few years, this group has killed multiple thousands of local leaders and others. And so Vietnam is difficult because it's hard to know who America is fighting. It gets really confusing really, really quickly. In general, America is fighting three groups that are allied with each other. The first group is the group we just talked about, the Viet Cong. These are South Vietnamese people who want to overthrow to overthrow Diem's regime and reunite with the North. We are also fighting, however, the Army of North Vietnam. Remember, North Vietnam is a country. They have an army. And so anytime you hear of big battles in Vietnam, it's probably the United States Army fighting the Army of North Vietnam. And by the way, in every single one of these encounters where it's the Army of North Vietnam versus the Army of the United States wins. But war is kind of weird. You could win every single battle and still lose the war. And finally, the third group we're fighting are northern infiltrators. These are northern guerrillas who will cross, usually through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which runs through Cambodia and Laos into South Vietnam, who infiltrate from the north into the south to provide leadership to the Viet Cong, to coordinate with the Viet Cong, to carry out operations. So these are the three groups that America is fighting, and 2 out of 3 of them aren't wearing a uniform, right? 2 out of 3 of them you can't tell from a South Vietnamese civilian. Now, the situation in South Vietnam is already bubbling. Things are going to come to a head in 1963. In 1963, Diem, who remember was a Catholic, attempted to make Catholicism the official religion of the country. The problem with this is that most Vietnamese people were Buddhists. Only about 10% of the Vietnamese population was Catholic. And even then, this may have been okay, in theory, if not for the sustained and intense persecution against Buddhists that Diem begins to unleash. He begins to target Buddhism, he begins to target monasteries, and this sparks a lot of outcry, and he's incredibly brutal. So brutal, in fact, that you'll see Buddhist monks sitting down in poses of meditation, pouring gasoline over their heads and lighting themselves on fire in protest to his methods. And instead of backing down in light of this widespread opposition and protest, Diem gets even more repressive and even more violent. And the more violent and the more repressive Diem gets, the more resistance he has. And the more resistance to him, the more repressive he gets, which leads to even more resistance. And so things are spiraling very, very quickly in South Vietnam. And so ultimately, we can characterize Diem's regime as one of repression, one of nepotism, where he's appointing family members, his wife, his brother-in-law, to positions of power, one of kleptocracy, where he's stealing from the government or getting kickbacks from the government, making money off the government, and one of brutality. By the fall of 1963, things in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, were very, very bad. It's at this point that, despite all this, though, as you can see on the Time magazine, right, the narrative is that South Vietnam is democratic, South Vietnam is free, America is helping to defend Vietnam from evil communists, they're happy we're here, and we're winning, right? This is the narrative that's being told to the American people. You have to ask yourself how democratic this regime really sounds. But things were so bad that in 63, several generals approached the United States and want to have a coup d'etat. They want to overthrow Diem. And the Kennedy administration is actually going to approve this coup. Basically, Kennedy says, yes, just don't kill him. And so the generals say, okay. And so they have a coup, and they kill him, and they kill his wife, and they kill his brother-in-law. And from there, we're just going to have a series of even less stable governments in South Vietnam, where they'll rise and they'll fall, and there's assassinations, and things are really, really unstable politically. And the only thing propping up this edifice of a government is American backing. Kennedy himself, who approved this coup, ironically, is only going to live a few more weeks. He also is going to be killed in November of 1963. But again, it's important to remember the narrative, because the narrative that the American people are being told throughout all this, and remember, the American public isn't really paying attention to this. The narrative is South Vietnam is democratic and free, but under attack by communists from the North. America has to help them survive. South Vietnam is happy that America is there, and we are winning. After Kennedy, and there you can probably hear my child screaming and crying. Apologies. After the Vietnam War, after Kennedy is assassinated, his vice president, LBJ, is going to take over. And LBJ is largely going to be continuing JFK's policies, mostly because there's really not a lot of downside. Now, he does take a lot of the blame for escalating the war in Vietnam, but in reality, he's only continuing the trends set in motion by Kennedy, who had already greatly expanded the American advisory presence in South Vietnam. So, why does he continue this process? Well, several reasons. The first is that there's really not much of a downside at this time. The American public was not yet against the war. Most people can't even find it on a map yet, right? It showed that he was tough on communism. This is something that has haunted Democrats for a decade, ever since Truman, quote unquote, lost China to communism. And so Democrats always had to kind of prove that they were hard on communism, whereas Republicans got more slack. And of course, American casualties at this point continued to be low. There weren't that many people getting hurt or injured. So there's really no downside to continuing these policies. A second reason is that LBJ is continuing Kennedy's policy of containment. Kennedy's Cold War strategy was called flexible response. And this is a type of symmetrical containment, wherein the U.S. tried to meet communist threats everywhere and anywhere it threatened, rather than being selective about which areas were important and which areas were not, like the Eisenhower administration. So to Kennedy and later to LBJ, Vietnam is just as important as England as far as communism is concerned. A third big issue is a fundamental misunderstanding by LBJ as to why the Vietnamese are fighting this war. For LBJ, he saw North Vietnamese aggression as directly linked to Chinese communist expansion, rather than as an indigenous nationalist movement. And that matters, because if this is just something that's being directed by somebody else, at a certain point the Vietnamese are going to be like, you know what, I'm not going to carry your water anymore, China, I'm done, right? But if this is really a struggle for existentialism, right, if this is a struggle for freedom, then the Vietnamese are probably going to hang on a lot longer. And then finally, he had public approval for this throughout the early years of the 1960s. The public isn't really going to turn against this until 1967. And so for the first several years, he has a compliant Congress and he has public approval. The event that is going to start the escalation of the war in Vietnam from simply just, advisors full on into military intervention is something called the Gulf of Tonkin Affair. So on August 2nd, you can see on the map where the Gulf of Tonkin is. On August 2nd, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin when North Vietnamese patrol boats opened fire on an American destroyer. Now, we know now that the destroyer was involved in gathering intelligence in the area and were actually supporting South Vietnamese military units operating against the North. So this is actually a legit military target. Nevertheless, we're going to later claim, of course, that we were just innocently floating there, right, and were unprovokedly attacked. 2 days later, on August 4th, there's another report of a, quote, unprovoked attack on U.S. forces in the Gulf by the Vietnamese. Though whether or not this second attack ever actually happened is highly debatable. Many historians think that this actually didn't even occur. Regardless of whether it did or it didn't, the first one certainly did. And LBJ is going to use these attacks to declare that the United States was viciously attacked by North Vietnamese forces. And he goes before Congress and says the United States has to defend itself. Congress, in response, is going to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution allows the president to assist any Southeast Asian country, and by any Southeast Asian country, read that as Vietnam, right? Assist any Southeast Asian country that is threatened by communist aggression. So that's it. That's the criteria. Are you in Southeast Asia? Check. Are you threatened by communist aggression? Check. And that's all it takes for America to come in. This essentially becomes a blank check. Johnson can assist them any way he wants. And it's this that he is going to use to be able to introduce combat troops into Vietnam. The first combat troops are going to arrive in March of 1965. You'll see a detachment of U.S. Marines arrive in Da Nang, and with this will bring the number of American troops in Vietnam to more than 100,000. Now, at the beginning of 1965, we have about 100,000. by the end of 1965, we have 180,000 troops in Vietnam, and by the end of 1967, we have more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam. And so this shows you that this war escalates very, very quickly. And to put this into context, in the war in Iraq that raged in the 2000s, even at the height of that war, the United States never had more than 200,000 troops in country. So who were these soldiers? There's a historian named Christian Abbey who writes on Vietnam quite a bit, and he has described Vietnam as a, quote, working class war. Approximately 80% of soldiers in Vietnam will come from blue-collar backgrounds. This also corresponds roughly to the same number who had only made it through high school and had no post-secondary education. And so men like Ron Kovic, who, if you're familiar with Born on the 4th of July, that movie and that book, men like Ron Kovic from working class families were much more proportionally likely to volunteer and or be drafted, and if they were drafted, actually to have to serve in Vietnam rather than being posted somewhere in the U.S. And just to put this in kind of concrete, example, there was a study done on Boston, and they looked at a working class suburb, and they looked at a few blocks over a wealthy suburb, and casualties for the working class suburb of Boston ran 4 times higher than the wealthier suburb right next door. The average age in the war was around 19. So, why this class discrepancy? Why is this a working class war? And the biggest reason for this is that most of the soldiers who are going to Vietnam are drafted, and the wealthier are able to evade service, or at least get less hazardous service in a number of ways. So the easiest way to do this was to get a draft deferment. One way to do this was through college. It was easier for college-educated people or for college students to get out of the draft or to be assigned to non-combat duties. Now, to a certain extent, this makes sense, right? If you have a PhD in economics, you're far more useful, figuring out logistical supply chains than you are shooting a gun in that trench, right? Because not many people know how to do that. But college deferments for students is a major difference from World War II. In World War II, you usually had to drop out of school and serve in the war if you were drafted, and that changes in Vietnam. And this helps to explain why there were such different feelings about the draft in these two wars. World War II's draft seemed much more fair than Vietnam's draft. Student deferments are going to last until 1971, though throughout that time, you could be reclassified and drafted if you had poor grades. And so sometimes students would go into their finals in college with a sign on their back that would say pass or die, because they knew if they failed their exam, they're headed to Vietnam, where they're probably going to come back in a body bag. Many historians also speculate that this is where grade inflation comes from. So, for example, if you look at the scale, an A is supposed to be superior, a B is good, a C is average, a D is needs improvement, and F is fail. So in theory, everybody should be getting a C. But now the kind of standard, what you're supposed to get are a B, which is good. And that happened probably because of Vietnam. Because me as a professor, I'm sitting there grading, and I'm like, oh, man, this essay is awful. Who is this? Oh, it's Bob. Bob's going to go to Vietnam if I fail him. Bob gets a D, right? So everything kind of got bumped up a letter grade. This is also why, of course, you have a lot of student protests being led by college students against the Vietnam War, because they felt this enormous sense of guilt, that they knew that the only thing keeping them out of Vietnam was the fact that they were lucky enough to go to college, where their cousin or their best friend weren't able to have that opportunity. And so how does this relate to class? Well, college attendance especially during this time period, but even today, is heavily, heavily influenced by class. Proportionally more wealthy people go to college, and proportionally they tend to do a lot better. And the biggest predictor as to whether or not you will go to college is whether or not your parents did and graduated. And so college attendance, even today, but especially during this time period, is very much a class issue. Another way you could get out of the Vietnam War was with a medical deferment to avoid service. Now, again, sometimes this is legit, right? If you're a diabetic and you rely on insulin, we can't be trying to get you refrigerated insulin in the middle of a firefight in the jungle, right? We can't. Thanks, but no thanks, right? So sometimes this is legit. But oftentimes you would see, especially wealthy people, getting bogus excuses to get out of Vietnam. Donald Trump, for example, got 5 draft deferments, and the last one he got was a note from his doctor claiming he was disabled due to bone spurs in his foot. I'll ask you whether or not you think Donald Trump looks disabled. So, medical deferments and being able to see a doctor or have a doctor write you a bogus note to get out of the draft, very much a class issue. Another way you could get out of going to Vietnam is if you entered the National Reserves or the National Guard, and that way you could avoid service in Vietnam. Part of the problem here is that there's lots and lots and lots of corruption. So, for example, there are practically 0 African Americans allowed in the reserves or guards in southern states during this time period. And it's not because they didn't try to get in. It also shouldn't be coincidence that George W. Bush, the son of a congressman, was able to join the National Guard and stay stateside. Or that Al Gore, the son of a senator, who does go to Vietnam but becomes a reporter rather than an artilleryman, right? These are all privileges of class and power. In addition to all this, the government is going to lower entrance standards so that fewer people, especially people who scored very low on the mental section of the entrance exam, were excluded from the draft. Many of these people will have sub 85 IQs. And so the argument here was that enlistment would be a positive social force for these men because it would provide them with remedial skills. In actuality, these people who had lower IQs, fewer than 10% of them ever actually received any extra training, and a disproportionate number of them went into combat units. The example here I like to give is Forrest Gump from the movie of Forrest Gump. While Vietnam is going on, remember the civil rights movement is in full swing. And so anti-war protests are going to be borrowing heavily from the civil rights movement. And this is going to be fueled by mainly students, college students, who feel an enormous sense of guilt about getting out of Vietnam. And so we're going to see a radical student activism begin to spread across college campuses in the early 1960s. A major group was called the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, who formed what they called the, quote, New Left movement. The New Left movement rejected the, quote, Old Left's ideologies of economic justice in favor of an ideology of social justice. And in support of that, they issued the Port Huron Statement in 1962 that argued that American idealism, which was bred by the Cold War, was contradicted by the realities of American life, such as segregation and the threat of nuclear war. In other words, that story that they're telling in the 1950s, that America is the freest country on earth and that we're the shining city on the hill and we're democratic and we're rich and we're powerful and we're awesome. They looked around and they said, yeah, but why can't my black friend go to school with me? Right? They didn't understand how reality wasn't matching up with the rhetoric. How can we be safe and free when I could be nuked at any given second? And so what SDS called for was something they termed participatory democracy by the people at large. In other words, it's not enough just to vote. You have to be engaged in the culture and engaged in the decision making. And this is largely a backlash against the conformity of the 1950s and their parents' generation. And so one of the things that we'll see with this participatory democracy is the use of shock value, of doing things that are intentionally offensive or intentionally confrontational to force people to pay attention to them. We also have the free speech movement spreading across college campuses as well. This begins first in Berkeley, California, and then across the nation, when in the 1960s students will begin protesting over the Vietnam War. They'll be protesting over politics. They'll be protesting over the curriculum and wanting a greater say in it. And it's thanks to this movement that students earned a say in the management of the college. So when, for example, student government associations got created. And it's also when we began to see things like ethnic studies being put into the curriculum, things like Black studies or Chicano studies, whereas before it was very much a top-down decision. Now students are having input as well into the types of classes that they wanted to take. So the anti-war movement, which is, prevalent all across the country, is very, very prevalent on college campuses as well. And it's really college campuses that are the epicenter for this. But again, this is a countrywide thing. One thing that we see beginning in 1965 are something called teach-ins, when professors would come in and they would shut the door and they'd sit down on the desk and they would say, okay, listen, I'm going to forget about what we were supposed to do today, forget about chapter 5. What I'm going to do today is I am going to tell you what is going on in Vietnam and tell you about the war in Vietnam and what this is all about. And for many college kids, this was the first time they had heard something other than the government's narrative that South Vietnam is democratic and free. We have to help them stave off the evil northern communists. They're happy we're there and we're winning, right? When professors sat down and started telling them about Diem's regime and the history of Vietnam and the larger politics of the Cold War, suddenly this started to look very, very different. And by 1967, there are massive protests across the country calling for an end to the Vietnam War, led by students. You also have major figures jumping in here. People like Martin Luther King Jr. was against the Vietnam War and speaking out against it. You had senators like J. William Fulbright, who will be challenging the war. And of course, you will also see it in pop culture. So I'm going to play right now a scene from Woodstock. If you're not familiar with what Woodstock was, this was part of the Counterculture. It was this massive 3-day outdoor concert in Woodstock, New York, where, the hippies and the yippies all gathered round. And so we're going to play Country Joe and the Fish's Vietnam song. And pay attention to two things. Remember, I told you one of the things that they're doing is shock value. So look at how he starts the song. And remember what the 1950s were like, how this would come across. And then secondly, look at how many people knew the words to this song, which tells you that this is something that is pretty mainstream.
Give me an F. Give me a U. Give me a C. Give me a K. What's that spell? 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 Well, come on, all of you big strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. I man, this war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made, supplying the army rules of the trade. Just overpaid it if they drop the bomb. We're dropping on the Viet Cong. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, generals, let's move fast. Your big chance is here at last. Now you can go out and get those reds, cause the only good commie is one that's dead. And you know that peace can only be won when you're blowing them all the kingdom come. Sing it! 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Louder! Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Listen, people, I don't know how you expect to ever stop the war if you can't sing any better than that. There's about 300,000 of you fuckers out there. I want you to start singing. Come on. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, I ain't no time to wonder why. Come on, mothers throughout the land, pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. The sing your sons off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block. Have your boy come home in the box. All right. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up early.
Ladies and gentlemen, country goal. Volume, please.
So again, note the shock value at the beginning, right? Why is he yelling the F-bomb? Well, that's shocking to somebody in the 1950s, right? So they're trying to get your attention. And you could see, these people knew this word to this song. How did I hear about the song? My mom sang it to me when I was a kid. That's the kind of household I came from. So you can see that the protest and the counterculture, it's very much mainstream. Speaking a little bit more about the counterculture, the group you probably most associate with the 1960s are the hippies. But you're probably confusing hippies with yippies. They're actually kind of two different groups. So let's distinguish them. Hippies rejected the traditional politics, social values, and corporate consumerism that we saw in the 1950s. Their attitude was tune out and drop out. They are basically rejecting American society as it was. And remember, American society focused on, you know, traditional values of the family, no premarital sex, go to high school, get a job in corporate America, earn lots of money, mom stay home and take care of the kids. And of course, buy things, right? You're free because you can shop. They just rejected that completely. And they aren't even trying to fix it, right? They didn't want to change society, so they're not protesting. They're not protesting against the war. They're not protesting against anything. Rather, they were tuning out and dropping out. And they just basically said, we're not going to play. We're not going to engage in society anymore. And so they will be embracing new attitudes about drugs, about sex, about popular culture, and about politics. And the yippies were different. The yippies are the radical activists. The yippies are the ones that are out there leading the protests against the Vietnam War, that are, the feminists. They are the ones that are trying to change things. They also are rejecting the attitudes of society, but they're engaged, whereas hippies have dropped out. And you see this also in the music of the time. So one of the most kind of emblematic songs of this time period is Times They Are A-Changin' by Bob Dylan. This is technically about the civil rights movement, but it's really kind of applicable to all the stuff that's going on in the 1960s, everything from the Vietnam War to feminism to civil rights.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Some writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. Was the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing. Senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. The battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing. Mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. The curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be past, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are a-changing.
So back to Vietnam. Let's talk about the tactics and the strategies that are going on. The fundamental problem in the Vietnam War was the control of the countryside, which was largely under the control at the local level of the Viet Cong. The cities are largely, the middle class at least in the cities and the upper class in the cities, tended to more align with the Diem regime or the South Vietnamese government after Diem is assassinated. But in the countryside, most people in the countryside are going to be sympathetic to the Viet Cong. And so two basic and kind of contradictory American strategies emerged to fight and win the war, and that is attrition and pacification. So a war of attrition is when you basically inflict so many casualties and so much damage upon the enemy that they no longer have either the capacity or the will to fight. And you may think that, okay, this is what all wars are, but not necessarily. There's a lot of different ways to fight a war that doesn't involve trying to kill as many of them as possible. But this is the strategy that America is going to be pursuing. And so on the nightly news in the 60s and in the 70s, you would actually have body counts. They would tell you nightly, here's how many enemies we killed today. Because, according to advisors for LBJ, once we hit the magic number, they'll quit, right? Unfortunately, that magic number kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And attached to this was the faulty assumption that technological superiority would allow the United States to be victorious. And this is, again, a theory that America continues even to this day, thinking that, America will automatically win in Afghanistan because our military is so much more powerful than the insurgent fighters there. Well, 19 years later, we can see maybe that's not entirely true. And so, in pursuit of this strategy, the United States is going to be bombing industrial strategic targets in both North and in South Vietnam. And in fact, more bombs will be dropped on Vietnam than in all the theaters in World War II. That's Africa, Europe, Japan, China, and the Pacific combined. But most of these bombs are actually going to fall on areas in South Vietnam under suspicion rather than in areas of North Vietnam, which helps to explain why a lot of South Vietnamese people weren't very supportive of American troops. It's real hard to like somebody who just bombed your village. And the bombing is also has very limited effectiveness because the North Vietnamese were less reliant upon industrial infrastructure. Most of their armaments they're getting from China. And the factories that they had built underground because they knew they were going to be bombed. The U.S. will also be frequently carpet bombing the jungle. You can see there a picture of what carpet bombing looks like. And this was largely done in an attempt to either disrupt Viet Cong insurgents and also to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the route that North Vietnamese insurgents followed through Cambodia and Laos into South Vietnam. The problem is that it's just that. It's a trail. It's not like this is a railroad or a road. And so it's impossible to target. I mean, bam, you hit it. There's a big crater in the ground. The guy just walks around the crater and keeps going. And so this tactic of attrition, ultimately wasn't going to work in the end because of the faulty U.S. assumption about what this war was about. Remember, Americans are thinking that this is a stratagem by Communist China to extend its control, to extend its power through communism into Vietnam. And that's what we think this is. And so if that's true, well, once enough Vietnamese people are killed, they're going to get tired of carrying China's water. But that's not what this was about for Vietnamese people. This was about, from their point of view, freedom. This was about being independent. And so this attrition strategy, the body count would have had to been much, much, much higher than what America thought it was if this was actually going to work. And in the end, Vietnam was willing to commit much more blood and much more treasure to this war than the U.S. was willing to. The second strategy that we see is pacification. And the goal with pacification was to convince, or in some cases coerce, local villagers not to support the Viet Cong. In other words, to quote, win their hearts and minds. This is where that phrase comes from. Make them want to support the South Vietnamese government. Make them want to support the American military effort and not support the Viet Cong. The problem was that the American military usually had a great deal of difficulty in establishing rapport with the locals, many of whom had much greater sympathy for the VC than they did for the Americans or for the government in Saigon. And ultimately, this policy ended up becoming kind of a brutal relocation program in the countryside, where American troops would sometimes evict people from their homes. They would come in and randomly search the place, looking for Viet Cong, looking for weapons. They would force people to leave and then destroy the village. They would burn it, destroy the crops to prevent these resources from going to the Viet Cong. They would use bulldozers. They would use bombs such as napalm, such as phosphorus, which today is illegal internationally. And they also would use chemical defoliants, the most famous of which was Agent Orange. And this is, an herbicide where they would just carpet bomb this stuff on the jungle to try to make it easier to fight. But it's poison, right? So we poison the land, we poison the water. And so Vietnam veterans, for example, have something called Agent Orange syndrome, where they have all these kind of horrible medical conditions from being exposed to this. And even to this day in Vietnam, they have a disproportionate number of birth defects every year because of the lingering effects of Agent Orange. And so it shouldn't be surprising then that the Americans often were not popular with the locals. Another kind of attempt to get rid of the VC was when Americans would go on what they called search and destroy missions. So if you've ever watched a Vietnam War movie and you see them kind of out walking around in the jungle and you're like, where are they going? This is what they're doing. They're looking around trying to find the Viet Cong. They're trying to find weapons depots. They're trying to find their camps, hopefully finding the enemy to shoot at them. And again, most of the time, the Viet Cong are not engaging in outright battles. They're using guerrilla tactics, so booby traps, hit and run, sabotage, terrorism, that kind of thing. So you have to ask the question then, okay, well, this all sounds very ineffective. If the problem is communist North Vietnam, why doesn't America just invade North Vietnam and end this? And the problem was China. LBJ had to balance the demands for greater intervention in Vietnam, issues of American power and legitimacy, and the quite real fear that if too heavy an American presence is invoked, this might provoke Chinese intervention. And just take a look at the Korean War and you see how messy that gets real quick. And so the United States never invades North Vietnam because we're afraid China will get involved and this war gets much bigger. And it didn't work out for the United States when China got involved in the Korean War. And so as a result, the strategy that we have is one of limited war, where we're not going all in. This isn't an all-in, let's have victory no matter the cost effort like you see in World War II. This was, let's try to have, guns and butter. Let's try to keep social spending and do this war. Let's not go all in, damn the consequences. Let's just kind of, it almost felt like not lose, as opposed to let's go in and win. Despite that strategy, the costs for this are going to keep rising. By the spring of 1966, more than 4,000 Americans will have been killed in Vietnam. And the material costs, likewise, keep mounting. Inflation at home is going to rise. And when that happened in August of 1967, LBJ had no choice but to ask Congress for a 10% tax increase to help avoid further inflation and to fund the war. This was, actually when we paid for stuff as opposed to now. And according to, research, this is actually the moment when a large part of society begins turning against this war. It wasn't the deaths. It wasn't even, Tet will be the nail in the coffin, but that tax increase is what gets the American public to start paying attention to this war and to start to turn against it. Now, LBJ did get his tax increase, but Congress only agreed to it with a $6 billion reduction in Great Society programs in exchange. And Great Society was what LBJ really wanted to concentrate on. He didn't want to fight this war in Vietnam. He wanted to concentrate on his Great Society programs, things like Medicaid, and Head Start, and Pell Grants, that kind of thing. And LBJ famously said, quote, I knew from the start if I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to fight that bitch of a war in Vietnam, then I would lose everything at home, unquote. And he did. Later on that year, in 1967, there will also be something called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive, Tet is the Lunar New Year. It's kind of the Vietnamese equivalent of Christmas and New Year's jammed together. And traditionally, there would be an unofficial truce during this time period. In 1967, the Viet Cong, in conjunction with the Army of North Vietnam, staged an offensive. They attack hundreds of cities across South Vietnam. They temporarily take over the embassy in Saigon. The important thing about Tet is that it is actually an overwhelming defeat for the Vietnamese forces, one that sets them back for years. But the entire thing is caught on camera. And for the first time, that narrative that Americans have been told, South Vietnam is democratic and free, we're saving them from evil communist North Vietnam, they're happy we're there, we're winning. Tet didn't look like we were winning. And Tet, the Vietnamese officials in Tet, certainly didn't look like the good guys either. And so the Tet Offensive is going to be the nail in the coffin for the popularity of the Vietnam War in the United States. And here it's kind of the turning point, right? The beginning of the end, when the American public has turned against this. So in light of Tet, in light of the widespread protest to the Vietnam War, LBJ makes the historic decision to not seek re-election in 1968, and he begins peace talks with North and South Vietnam in Paris. As LBJ refused to run for re-election in 1968, it looked like John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, would kind of follow in his footsteps and become the Democratic nominee, but he also will be assassinated in 1968. And so, with all that kind of chaos, Richard Nixon is going to end up winning in a landslide in the 1968 election. Nixon argued for a restoration of law and order, as well as traditional values. And so law and order is partly a response to, the student activism, but this is also a dog whistle. By law and order, he is signaling to southern states that he does not support the civil rights movement. So this is very much something called the Southern Strategy, wherein Nixon is actively courting segregationists in the South to come to the Republican Party. And we see that Southern realignment today, where the South is almost totally Republican and the North is almost totally Democratic. This is when that alignment begins. And it's because the Republican Party under Nixon lets them know that they're not going to be on the side of civil rights, whereas before, it was more split. He's also calling for traditional values, so rejecting the hippie culture that you see, which was really disturbing for a lot of parents, right? Nixon claimed that there was a, quote, silent majority of Americans who still supported the Vietnam War and who had not joined the counterculture. And, it turned out he was right, because he does, like I said, win in a landslide. He also campaigned on a, quote, secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, and he would end it with, quote, peace with honor, unquote. Which sounds awesome. Who doesn't want peace with honor? The problem is he didn't actually have a plan. He had a nice slogan, but he had no plan at all. And so, in 1968, when the Tet Offensive happens, I'm sorry, I think in the last slide I said 67. In 1968, when the Tet Offensive happened, this really kind of set the stage for Nixon to come in with an uncertain set of affairs. And it's this Tet Offensive that is going to cause Americans to lose confidence in the war. And so here's some news footage from the Tet Offensive.
Military police got back into the compound of the $2.5 million embassy complex at dawn. Before that, a platoon of Viet Cong were in control. The communist raiders never got into the main Chancery building. A handful of Marines had it locked and kept them out. But the raiders were everywhere else. By daylight, Counterculture Boulevard, where the embassy is located, was a battleground. No one, unless identified, was allowed on the street.
Get back!
An Australian military policeman was standing guard, firing warning shots to keep the street clear. The bodies of 2 American military policemen who died as they tried to assault the compound lay near their jeep across the boulevard. This is where the Viet Cong raiders broke in. They'd sneaked up and blasted a hole in the reinforced concrete fence surrounding the compound. They had the big embassy wall to protect them. They were inside before anyone knew it. But none of the raiders lived to tell of their exploit. By 8 o'clock, 5 hours after they first broke in, almost all of them were dead. All in civilian clothes, they'd been armed with American M16 rifles and also rocket launchers and rockets. They had explosives, their purpose apparently to destroy the embassy. In that purpose, they did not succeed.
A villa on the embassy grounds was the residence of the mission coordinator, George Jacobson. He was trapped there on the second floor. American soldiers tossed him weapons to defend himself. Later, when it was all over, Jacobson told what had happened.
What could you see from your window? Were the VC in the buildings?
No, I did not see any VC in the building, except that I knew that there was at least one VC in my house. I knew that he was on the bottom floor of my house.
You had quite an escape at the very end. How did that happen?
Well, they put riot gas into the bottom floors of my house, which of course would drive whoever was down below up top where I was. They had thrown me a pistol about 10 minutes before this occurred. And with all the luck that I've had all of my life, I got him before he got me.
With the pistol?
Sorry.
And he had what?
An M16.
And you got him.
The commanding general, William Westmoreland, described the embassy attack as a Viet Cong defeat.
General, how would you assess yesterday's activities and today's? What is the enemy doing? Are these major attacks?
That's EOD setting off a couple of M79 duds, I believe.
General, how would you assess the enemy's purposes yesterday and today?
The enemy very deceitfully has taken advantage of the Tet truce in order to create maximum consternation within South Vietnam, particularly in the populated areas. In my opinion, this is diversionary to his main effort, which he had planned to take place in Quang Tri province, from Laos toward Khe Sanh and across the demilitarized zone. This attack has not yet materialized. His schedule has probably been thrown off balance because of our very effective airstrikes. Now, yesterday, the enemy exposed himself by virtue of this strategy, and he suffered great casualties.
Other battles were raging in the streets of Saigon, one not far from the presidential palace. An attack on the palace itself had been driven back. The enemy had been planning the Tet Offensive for the past 6 months. Almost 100 tons of military supplies had been moved into the region around Saigon. The Viet Cong had chosen a number of strategic targets. Don Webster described the battle for one of them.
This is the main Vietnamese language radio station in Saigon, and right now there are an undisclosed number of VC inside occupying the station. They are not broadcasting on the air, and they're surrounded by South Vietnamese troops, and they're pinned down inside. We think they're going to be throwing tear gas any moment now to try to get them out that way. There's been a lot of shooting out the windows from inside, up on the second floor. The attack on the radio station started at 2:30 in the morning. The Viet Cong pulled up in cars. They killed the guards outside and stormed the station. The suicide squad of Viet Cong apparently intended to blow up the station rather than just taking it over. The large packages carry plastique, more than enough to blow up the entire station, including the Viet Cong. Even now, 8 hours after the attack started, there are still a few Viet Cong hiding inside the station. One by one, the VC are located and killed, and their bodies are unceremoniously dragged outside and down the street.
The communists did not succeed in broadcasting from the station, but they did destroy much of its equipment before they were killed or captured. Five days after the combat began, the enemy was still fighting. George Severson described the battle in one of Saigon's slums.
This neighborhood is called Ban Kur, or the chessboard, because of the maze of alleys and passageways. Its residents are mostly poor working people, and its slums are a refuge for Saigon's hoodlum and criminal elements. A Southeast Asian version of the Lower East Side or the Algerian Casbah. Vietnamese Rangers and Marines moved carefully, blasting buildings and possible Viet Cong hiding places before moving ahead. This was the first time heavy fighting has taken place in Saigon proper. Until now, most of it has been in the Chinese section of Cho Lan and in the suburbs. The VC were difficult to dislodge. They obviously knew the section well and had built barricades in key spots. Often, the only way around them was to take to the roofs. The Rangers and Marines took casualties, mostly from hidden snipers. The enemy was nowhere and everywhere.
So Westmoreland, who's the commander in Vietnam, was right. The Tet Offensive did expose the Vietnamese Viet Cong, and it did lead to a heavy loss. But you watch this video, and suddenly that narrative that we're winning, that Americans had been told for years, didn't look right. Americans were shocked to see the Viet Cong in control of the U.S. Embassy. They were shocked to see fighting like this on the streets of Saigon. And as a result, Americans lost confidence in the war. And so when Nixon was campaigning and he promising to bring peace with honor to the conflict of Vietnam, this sounds like a desirable alternative, right? So how was he going to do it? Well, he never actually said, right? So when he got into office, it became very clear that he had little concrete to offer in terms of finding a settlement. The one idea that he had was something called Vietnamization. Vietnamization was the process of training and equipping the army of South Vietnam. Now, of course, this is what we were supposed to be doing all along, but now we're going to make it more front and center. And he does have some success with this. By 1969, around 60,000 American troops are able to withdraw from Vietnam. And it's those withdrawals, that begins to quiet domestic opposition to the war. So we begin to see the anti-war movement kind of draw down. And by the fall of 1972, there are going to be fewer than 60,000 troops left in Vietnam, down from a maximum of almost 550,000. And while the withdrawals did help quiet domestic opposition, it did not, however, break the impasse in peace negotiations with North Vietnam then taking place in Paris. And so while American troops are withdrawing, we're still no closer to peace with honor than when Nixon first took over. The peace negotiations in Paris began in 1968 and would continue until 1963. And they were largely spurred by Henry Kissinger, who was first the National Security Advisor and then also made Secretary of State. Now, Kissinger and Nixon had seemingly contradictory positions. They believed that escalation of the war lay at the solution to their problems. And so, in other words, they thought that they had to make the war worse in order to make peace achievable. I'll let you decide whether or not if somebody is bombing you, if you really feel like, talking things out with them. So, they do begin escalating the war. They begin to bomb parts of Cambodia. Remember, this is a third country now, not involved. Prior to this, they began bombing parts of Cambodia as early as 1969 in an attempt to destroy Viet Cong resupply bases. They will then support a 1970 coup d'etat in Cambodia, which brought in a pro-American leader who, just coincidentally, I'm sure, acquiesced to American incursions into his own country to, quote, clean out suspected enemies. That's going to lead to some significant blowback later on against his regime and will help to bring in the Khmer Rouge. If you're unfamiliar with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, that nickname in Cambodian history is called the Killing Field, to let you know how well that went. But once the war escalates, once we begin bombing Cambodia, once again you see the anti-war movement rise up. There had been a temporary lull because of all the troop withdrawals, but with the bombing and invasion of Cambodia, once again we see the anti-war movement heat up on college campuses. But now they're going to start to turn deadly. On May 4th, 1970, at Kent State, there were riots, and the Ohio National Guard is going to open fire on college protesters, killing 4 college students. There you can see the Life magazine cover. And 10 days later, police will kill 2 students at Jackson State in Mississippi. So with all this going on, by December of 1970, Congress has finally had enough, and they will repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that thing that gave the blank check to the president to allow to intervene in Vietnam. Unfortunately, Nixon largely ignores this in the Vietnam War, and the protests will continue. The end is going to be a series of things that all kind of come to a head at once. In June of 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts of what has come to be called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a classified study on the Vietnam War, and what they showed was that the U.S. government had been dishonest with the American public, both about its motives for being in Vietnam, as well as in reporting American successes in the war. And so Americans discover suddenly that they've been lied to, not only about quote-unquote winning, but also about why we were fighting in the first place. At the same time around the same time that this is happening, there is the 1971 conviction of William Calley for his participation in something called the My Lai Massacre, which took place in March of 1968. And so when the events of the massacre became known, the American public was shocked and horrified. And when you put these two things together, many began to question, what was the U.S. doing in Vietnam? We were supposed to be the good guys. And My Lai and the Pentagon Papers didn't make us seem to be the good guys. In fact, we kind of look like the bad guys. So here is a short video on the My Lai massacre.
This is Lee doing it. This is Cody 6, time 0722. Over. Warlord lead, County 3, second LZ will be stepped up approximately 60 minutes. Over. Second LZ stepped up 60 minutes. Thank you very much. 46 over. This is Storm lead with 3 minutes out of distance. This is 46, Roger. No restrictions on door gunners. Cody 6, touchdown 0730. LZ appeared to be over. 36, Roger, take your time, and get him out of those holes, over.
You were requested that you not either directly or indirectly or through any other means discuss the My Lai incident, the investigation of the My Lai incident, or the investigation which we are conducting with others. We're investigating a situation wherein at the present moment we can say that we know beyond a doubt that well over 200 Vietnamese, and maybe up to 500 of them were killed, and that isn't all of the story. There were numerous rapes that took place. The houses were all destroyed. 6 additional sub-hamlets were burned to the ground. All of the animals were destroyed. It's just not the people in Taft-Fort Barker that's on trial. In the eyes of the American public, it's the Army. It's you and it's me, and it includes our country. And it includes our people in the eyes of the world.
We're right off the beach now. There's a lot of small arms fire coming from that direction on the beach. Is that your people over? Bravo 6 would like to know if you can get him some ammo out. Just send what he needs in a few minutes over.
That day it just was a massacre. Just plain right out wiping out people.
It's been suggested that the orders were given so that this little hamlet would just be wiped out as a base for the VC to level the village.
Wipe it out.
Wipe it out so that nobody could live there anymore and support the VC.
Right. Right, sir.
Did you have the same impression?
When you get the command or the orders saying to wipe everything, kill anything and everything, that's what it is. You're just wiping it right off the map. To me, the way we hear it, we figured that the Viet Congs were there with their supporters. Now, when we were sweeping out the area, we didn't find nothing but the civilian people.
I was coming down the trail, and I noticed bringing these people out, and they grabbed, I believe it was this girl behind this woman here, and brought her out front, and they wanted to see what she was more or less made out of. They started, stripping her, taking the top piece off and that. And the mother, that wasn't her mother, was trying to protect her. The GIs were punching her around. I remember one of them kicking her in the ass, and I took a photograph of this. Then I sort of turned away, and all of a sudden I heard two M16s open on automatic fire, and I could notice out of the corner of my eye the bodies falling over.
Lieutenant Calley came over to Medlow and Carter and told them to can they take care of this group. Medlow and Carter were actually, playing with the kids, telling the people where to sit down, and giving the kids candy. And Lieutenant Calley left and came back a couple of minutes later and asked them, I think the words he used was, why haven't you wasted them yet? After I heard shooting behind me, and then Lieutenant Calley came back up.
You had another group at this time?
Yes. Lieutenant Calley came up from behind me and said, get them all into this ditch. And he says, something like start shooting, or get in order to shoot. And I just stood there, I couldn't do it.
Medlow there this time?
Medlow came up after Lieutenant Calley started to shoot. He was crying at the time when he came up. And they both started firing into the ditch.
About how many people were in the ditch, to your judgment?
It's hard to say. I think there was about 50 to 75 or so.
What were their ages and sexes? As an estimate?
A few old men, women, and babies. A few small kids.
When I saw the bodies in the ditch, I came back around and saw that some of them were still alive. So I sat down on the ground then and talked to, pretty sure it was a sergeant, colored sergeant. And I asked him, well, I told him that there was, women and kids over there that were wounded. Could he help them? Or could they help them? And he made something to the remark, the only way he could help them was to kill them. And I thought he was joking, or didn't take him seriously. And I took off again, and as I took off, my crew chief said that the guy was shooting into the ditch.
The guy would just grab one of the girls there, and in one or two incidents, they shot the girls when they got done. And when we were about halfway through the village was when we got word over the radio to quit killing people. That Captain Medina says that that's enough shooting now, they have to quit now. And to me it didn't make any sense. I couldn't figure out why we had to quit right now, when Medina said we were going to go through, but all I could ever figure out was, we figured he got away with as much as he probably thought we were going to get away with, or something like this,
And I saw this bunker in and either one of the crew chief or the gunner said that there was a bunch of kids in the bunker, and the Americans were approaching it. So I sat down in the middle of that horseshoe and got out of the aircraft and talked with this lieutenant, and I told him that there's some women and kids in that bunker over there, but he got them out. He said the only way he could get them out was with a hand grenade. So I told him, I said, just hold your men right where they are and I'll get the kids out. And I walked over towards the bunker and motioned for them to come out. And I called Mr. Malines. He was flying the low gun cover, and told him what I had, and asked him to come in and get them out of this immediate area back into an area that's not so much firing going on.
Was there anything discussed about the destruction of villages and the burning of preachers?
Yes, we were supposed to be a search and destroy mission, and one of the orders that I thought I heard or somebody did say was to shoot anything that moves.
Anything?
Yes, that's the way I received the order. We were led to believe that this area that we were going into was either all VC or they were BC supporters. I thought the area was supposed to be cleared, like the people were supposed to have evacuated the area, because we found out there were many, many civilians.
Did you hear any firing while the search was being conducted?
Yes.
Where was the firing?
Well, our machine gunner, he was...
So you get the gist. So that happens, that conviction and investigation is made clear in 71. The events happened in 68, but the trial, William Calley is convicted of war crimes in 71, around the same time that the Pentagon Papers drops. And, Americans were horrified. What are we doing? Are we the good guys? We're supposed to be the good guys. Nevertheless, in February of 1971, Nixon still continued to ignore Congress's repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin's resolution. He continued to ignore Congress's calls for an American withdrawal, and he even supported a South Vietnamese army's invasion of Laos that same year, though that was defeated. Finally, in 1972, Nixon does see the writing on the wall. He knows that the Vietnam War is lost, yet he continued his contradictory practice of increasing attacks just when peace was at hand. And when in negotiations, the South balked at dropping the condition of the withdrawal of North Vietnamese army forces from the South, which both the U.S. and North Vietnamese agreed could stay. Nixon ordered some of the most destructive air raids of the war, in which American B-52s dropped bombs on Hanoi, the harbor at Haiphong, and other targets. Civilian casualties in North Vietnam were extremely high, and U.S. casualties were very high. In this bombing campaign, the United States will use, in what's called the Christmas bombing, the United States lost 16 aircraft. Up until that point, only one had been lost the entire war. And so for 2 weeks, this bombing continued before the United States returned to the negotiating table. The peace accords were finally signed on January 27, 1973. But this was neither actually peace nor very honorable. The accords first promised the return of hundreds of Americans as prisoners of war. This was a big issue for the United States. The late Senator John McCain famously was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War and faced torture at the hands of the Viet Cong. The accords also allowed the South Vietnamese regime to remain in place. But, and here is the big but, so too would the North Vietnamese army forces be able to stay in parts of South Vietnam that they had previously taken. The accords also said that an as yet unformed committee would work out a more permanent settlement. And ironically, these terms were very, very similar to those suggested by the North in 1969. But an additional 25,000 U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese would have to die before the United States would accept them. So aside from Vietnam, though it's kind of hard to separate that, Nixon actually had a fairly good foreign policy. Under Nixon, he will pursue a policy of détente in the Cold War. Détente is a French term meaning a relaxing or an easing of tensions, and it refers to a more relaxed relations with America's enemies of China and the Soviet Union. And one of the things that Nixon would do that was so successful was what he called linkages. He would frequently link together items that didn't necessarily go together. So, for example, the Soviet Union, because of farm collectivization issues, among other things, always had a hard time feeding itself, and America has an abundance of farm crops, specifically wheat. And so Nixon agreed to begin to sell wheat to the Soviet Union, which before we didn't trade with them. But in exchange, he linked the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation talks, the SALT talks, trying to reduce nuclear weapons and put in nuclear treaties. During the 1970s, the relationship between the Soviet Union and China became strained. They actually almost fight a war with each other at one point. And Nixon took advantage of that by opening talks with China. Remember, the U.S. had broken off relations with China in 1949 after it became communist. And in a surprise move in 1972, Nixon himself went to China, thereby, quote, opening China, and reestablished diplomatic relations with them. And so he's doing this partly to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union, but he's also doing this with linkages because, of course, he hopes that he told China, hey, we'll reopen negotiations with you, but in return, you need to put pressure on the North Vietnamese at the peace talks. Incidentally, they didn't have much success on this because, again, for North Vietnam, they were the ones driving this, not China. And so Nixon, he also had a lot of good domestic achievements, things like the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air and Water Act, Occupational and Safety Hazard Administration, right? OSHA gets established. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that's what it stands for. But all of this gets overshadowed by Vietnam and, of course, Watergate. So, it's domestic forces that will ultimately force Nixon to leave office. So here's what happened. In 1972, there is going to be a presidential election, and Nixon is popular. He probably is not going to lose this election, but he decides to cheat anyway. And so in 1972, members of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, appropriately nicknamed CREEP, decided to break into the Democratic National Committee office and plant bugs and steal files. Now keep in mind that this is zero difference from, say Russia hacking the DNC in support of another candidate, right? Nixon didn't know this burglary was going to take place beforehand, but he certainly didn't mind making use of the material. And likewise, electronically, Russia hacked into the Democratic National Convention, and Donald Trump didn't mind making use of that material. Whether or not he knew it would happen beforehand is debatable and certainly not proven. Any event, after this happened and Nixon finds out, he helps to cover it up. Now, Nixon was famous for what he called dirty tricks. He liked to get dirt on his opponents and use it against them. And it went beyond just things like planting bugs in the DNC. For example, Daniel Ellsberg, the guy who published the Pentagon Papers, they actually broke into his psychiatrist's office to try to get stuff to discredit Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. So this is all kind of par for the course for Nixon. So as the investigation is getting closer and closer to the president, and again, it wasn't that he ordered the break-in, he didn't, but he did order the cover-up. Eventually, it starts to get too close to Nixon, and he orders what's called the Saturday Night Massacre. So on October 20th, 1973, Nixon ordered the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire the special prosecutor who was investigating Watergate, and his name was Archibald Cox. Elliot Richard, the Attorney General, refused to fire the special prosecutor, Cox, and resigned immediately. Once he resigned, the next person in line was the Deputy Attorney General. His name is William Ruckelshaus. Nixon ordered him to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned immediately. And then finally it went to the third person in line, and this was the Solicitor General of the Justice Department, a guy named Robert Bork, who finally did what Nixon wanted and fired the special prosecutor. That, however, did not stop the investigation. The investigation continued, especially when it became clear that there was a recording device in the Oval Office that recorded all the conversations had there. And so Congress subpoenaed the tapes surrounding the Watergate time, and Nixon refused to turn it over, citing executive privilege. And so this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. That court case is U.S. v. Nixon, where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Nixon and ordered him to turn over the tape, citing that the president was not above the law. And so when Nixon turns over the tapes, it just so happens that just at the part where he's about to start talking about Watergate, there's a blank spot. That part of the tape was accidentally erased somehow, and he blamed his secretary. So the House, with all this, began drafting articles of impeachment. Remember, impeaching a president is a two-step process. Impeachment means to bring charges. So you get charged with a crime, right? Like you go before the judge and the judge says, what are they charged with? And you say, we charged them with murder. Okay, so that's the House's job. That is what impeachment is. And once the president is impeached, it then goes to the Senate, where there is a trial. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the presiding judge, not really a judge, more of a presiding officer there. And the senators are the jury, and 2/3 have to vote he's guilty to remove him or he gets acquitted. So the House, in light of all this, begins drafting articles of impeachment. They did not impeach Nixon. They did not get that far because patriots in the Senate, people like Barry Goldwater, who were Republicans, went to Nixon and said, you're guilty, and we're not going to vote to acquit you. We're not going to have a criminal in office. And with that, Nixon will be the only president to resign, and he does so in 1974. After he resigns, ordinarily the vice president would take over, but unfortunately there wasn't a vice president at this time. Why? Because Nixon's vice president, a guy named Spiro Agnew, had to resign under tax fraud. So this is kind of a criminal enterprise we have going on here. And so what ends up happening is the third in line, the Speaker of the House, Gerald Ford, takes over. One of the first things Gerald Ford does is pardons Nixon for any and all crimes. And this is when Americans, by a large degree, began to lose faith in their government. And you can see this in opinion polls. The research clearly shows that it's here where American trust in government takes a nosedive. Because it was very clear that Nixon was guilty, that he abused his power, that he covered this up, and he gets away with it. And, American trust in institutions and government has never recovered from this. So Ford is really, and that killed Gerald Ford's political career as well. People were extremely angry that he did this. In Ford's defense, he said he was doing this so the country could move on. We needed to move past Watergate. We had other things to deal with. But in the long run, this did a lot more harm than good, and it effectively ended Gerald Ford's career. So American politics oftentimes swings as a pendulum, right? We go all the way to one side, and then we go, ooh, that's too far, and then we swing all the way to the other side, and back and forth. And so if you wanted to go a complete 180 away from Nixon, the place you go is to Jimmy Carter. And so Jimmy Carter will win election in 1976. So how does Watergate compare to the recent impeachment of Donald J. Trump? So what was Trump impeached for? Well, it goes back to Ukraine. There was this ongoing scheme by Donald Trump involving multiple people, including Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, including Trump's hand-picked ambassador to the European Union, a guy named Gordon Sondland, wherein Trump was going to try to coerce Ukraine into opening a sham investigation. Now, important background to this is that Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine once again became an independent country. A few years ago, Russia invaded a part of Ukraine called the Crimea, and Ukraine and Russia at this time are in an active, hot war with each other. And so this is a matter of life and death. The United States is backing Ukraine in this fight. It is not in the United States' interest to have Russia take over Ukraine, because what's next? What other parts of Eastern Europe? It's not in our interest for Russia to recreate the Soviet Union. A problem that Ukraine had, though, was with corruption. And so a new president over the summer was elected in Ukraine. His name was Volodymyr Zelensky, and he ran on an anti-corruption platform. And so essential to Ukraine and to Zelensky are two things. The first is military aid that the United States is giving it to fight the Russians. And the second thing that was very important to Zelensky was a White House meeting with the American president. Why? Because this is a clear signal to the people of the Ukraine, but also to Vladimir Putin's Russia, that America is firmly backing Ukraine in this fight, and that we have Ukraine's back. So, what begins to happen, though, is that as it became clear that Joe Biden was leading in the polls and was beating Trump in head-to-head polls for the upcoming presidential election in 2020, he began pressuring Zelensky to open up a sham investigation into Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, over work that he had done years before for a Ukrainian company. This all culminates in a phone call on July 25th, 2019, wherein Trump demanded a, quote, favor from Zelensky, and he very much implies in this phone call that this favor needed to be done before vital military aid would be released. In addition to this phone call, this is also being communicated to Ukraine through various back channels, through Sondland, through Giuliani, and from testimony during the impeachment trial, it was very clear that Ukraine knew that this was contingent on this investigation. The aid would not be forthcoming unless the investigation was announced. Not actually done. The requirement was announced. So this is very clearly to jeopardize Joe Biden's presidential campaign. Now, eventually, a whistleblower who was on this July phone call was extremely alarmed by what they heard, and they actually file a complaint to the Inspector General. The Inspector General eventually has to turn this complaint over to Congress, despite the fact that Trump and William Barr, who is the Attorney General, tried to stop it. When Congress tried to hold hearings on this and issued subpoenas to people for documents and for testimony, the White House refused to turn over a single document and prevented multiple officials from testifying. Officials that did respond to the lawful subpoenas and testified ultimately were retaliated against. And so in light of all this, the House impeached Donald Trump on December 18, 2019 for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And once the impeachment happened, it then went to the Republican-controlled Senate, and unprecedentedly, the Senate refused to allow any witness testimony or any documents. And this has never actually happened before. And indeed, none of the charges against Trump were actually refuted. Nobody argued that this didn't happen. And so I'd like to play a bit of Adam Schiff, who is one of the House managers, part of his closing statement in the trial in the Senate.
But even now, our ally can't get his foot in the door. Even now, our ally can't get his foot in the door. And this brings me to the last point I want to make tonight, which is, when we're done, we believe that we will have made the case overwhelmingly of the president's guilt. That is, he's done what he's charged with. He withheld the money. He withheld the meeting. He used it to coerce Ukraine to do these political investigations. He covered it up. He obstructed us. He's trying to obstruct you. And he's violated the Constitution. But I want to address one other thing tonight. Okay, he's guilty. Okay, he's guilty. Does he really need to be removed? Does he really need to be removed? We have an election coming up. Does he really need to be removed? He's guilty. You know, is there really any doubt about this? I mean, do we really have any doubt about the facts here? Does anybody really question whether the president is capable of what he's charged with? No one is really making the argument Donald Trump would never do such a thing. Because of course we know that he would, and of course we know that he did. It's a somewhat different question, though, to ask, okay, it's pretty obvious whether we can say it publicly or we can't say it publicly. We all know what we're dealing here with this president. But does he really need to be removed? And this is why he needs to be removed. Donald Trump chose Rudy Giuliani over his own intelligence agencies. He chose Rudy Giuliani over his own FBI director. He chose Rudy Giuliani over his own national security advisors. When all of them were telling him this Ukraine 2016 stuff is kooky, crazy Russian propaganda, he chose not to believe them. He chose to believe Rudy Giuliani. That makes him dangerous to us, to our country. That was Donald Trump's choice. Now, why would Donald Trump believe a man like Rudy Giuliani over a man like Christopher Wray? Okay? Why would anyone in their right mind believe Rudy Giuliani over Christopher Wray? Because he wanted to, and because what Rudy was offering him was something that would help him personally. And what Christopher Wray was offering him was merely the truth. What Christopher Wray was offering him was merely the information he needed to protect his country and its elections. But that's not good enough. What's in it for him? What's in it for Donald Trump? This is why he needs to be removed. Now, you may be asking, how much damage can he really do in the next several months until the election? A lot. A lot of damage. Now, we just saw last week a report that Russia tried to hack or maybe did hack Burisma. Okay? I don't know if they got in. I'm trying to find out. My colleagues on the Intel Committee, House and Senate, we're trying to find out, did the Russians get in? What are the Russian plans and intentions? Well, let's say they got in. And let's say they start dumping documents to interfere in the next election. Let's say they start dumping some real things they hacked from Burisma. Let's say they start dumping some fake things they didn't hack from Burisma, but they want you to believe they did. Let's say they start blatantly interfering in our election again to help Donald Trump. Can you have the least bit of confidence that Donald Trump will stand up to them and protect our national interest over his own personal interest? You know you can't, which makes him dangerous to this country. You know you can't. You know you can't count on him. None of us can. None of us can. What happens if China got the message? Now you can say, well, he's just joking. Of course, he didn't really mean China should investigate the Bidens. You know that's no joke. Now maybe you could have argued 3 years ago when he said, hey, Russia, if you're listening, hack Hillary's emails. Maybe you could give him a freebie and say he was joking. But now we know better. Hours after he did that, Russia did, in fact, try to hack Hillary's emails. There's no mulligan here when it comes to our national security. So what if China does? Overtly or covertly start to help the Trump campaign. You think he's going to call him out on it? Or you think he's going to give him a better trade deal on it? Can any of us really have the confidence that Donald Trump will put his personal interests ahead of the national interest? Is there really any evidence in this presidency that should give us the ironclad confidence that he would do so? You know you can't count on him to do that. That's the sad truth. You know you can't count on him to do that. The American people deserve a president they can count on to put their interest first. To put their interest first.
Now, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration was given their first briefing on this in December, and because it could possibly damage the economy, perhaps because he didn't want to hear it, who knows, but the Trump administration did not order tests, did not begin locking down cities, did not begin ordering protective gear, did not begin any of the steps needed to be taken to protect the country from COVID-19, even though we had, several months warning that this was coming. Largely, many speculate because he didn't want to jeopardize his re-election prospects. And so many historians and national security officials argue that Adam Schiff's warning was correct, that when it came down to Trump's re-election prospects versus protecting the country, Trump chose himself. In the end, all the Democrats and only one Republican, Senator Mitt Romney, voted to acquit, or voted to convict. So it was a 48 yes, he's guilty, 52 no, well short of the 2/3 needed for removal. So he was ultimately acquitted. Mitt Romney is the only person in history to vote to remove a president from his own party. And so here is part of his speech.
As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I am profoundly religious. My faith is at the heart of who I am. I take an oath before God as enormously consequential. I knew from the outset that being tasked with judging the president, the leader of my own party, would be the most difficult decision I have ever faced. I was not wrong. The President's counsel also notes that Vice President Biden appeared to have a conflict of interest when he undertook an effort to remove the Ukrainian prosecutor general. If he knew of the exorbitant compensation his son was receiving from a company actually under investigation, the Vice President should have recused himself. While ignoring a conflict of interest is not a crime, it is surely very wrong. With regards to Hunter Biden, Taking excessive advantage of his father's name is unsavory, but also not a crime. Given that in neither the case of the father nor the son was any evidence presented by the President's counsel that a crime had been committed, the President's insistence that they be investigated by the Ukrainians is hard to explain other than as a political pursuit. There's no question in my mind that were their names not Biden, the President would never have done what he did. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the President committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The President asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The President withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The President delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The President's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the President is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine. With my vote, I will tell my children and their children that I did my duty to the best of my ability, believing that my country expected it of me. I will only be one name among many, no more, no less, to future generations of Americans who look at the record of this trial. They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the President did was wrong, grievously wrong. We are all footnotes at best in the annals of history, but in the most powerful nation on earth, the nation conceived in liberty and justice, that distinction is enough for any citizen.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel.
So, many historians, the consensus is that this was worse than Watergate. Watergate certainly was an abuse of power, but the impeachment of Trump, the Ukrainian scandal, was an abuse of power that endangered U.S. national security. And as Adam Schiff warned, when it came down to the president's re-election prospects versus what's best for the country, there seems to be some doubt as to which side of that coin Trump would have chosen. So to end the discussion of the 1970s and the Cold War, we have to now switch over to Jimmy Carter. So when Jimmy Carter came in, he promised to be a different kind of politician in the sense that he promised to promote human rights as opposed to simply containment. And this is a big shift in U.S. foreign policy. Up until this point, as long as you were anti-communist, you didn't necessarily have to be democratic, right? You could be as evil as you wanted to be so long as you were American-friendly and anti-Soviet. And that begins to initially change, anyway, under Carter. So we saw this, for example, when former anti-communist allies such as Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua and the Shah of Iran fell from power. The United States refused to intervene to prop these dictators back up. Many critics blame Carter for the subsequent fallout of that, but maybe it's more accurate to blame the United States for putting them there in the first place. It's also under Carter that we finally see the end of the Vietnam War, truly, and this is with the fall of Saigon in 1975. So after the peace accords in 1973, most U.S. troops leave Vietnam. But 2 years later, in 1975, the North will launch an invasion of the South. Now, the North didn't actually expect this to succeed. It was more meant to be harassing. But the South Vietnamese government had been so weak for so long that there was really not much propping it up. And the North was just as surprised as anybody when the South Vietnamese government collapses. Carter did ask Congress to authorize intervention, and Congress refused to do so. And so here's some video of the fall of Saigon.
Saigon was now encircled, and South Vietnamese troops could not move out more than 10 miles along any road. Beyond that, the communists were waiting. Outside the American embassy, the wise, the wealthy, and those with any known American connection had been queuing night and day, demanding, pleading for a visa and a ticket for a seat on the United States evacuation planes flying out of Ton Son Nhut Airport. Then on the morning of the 29th of April, North Vietnamese artillery began shelling the airport, and their forward commando units attacked the city's outer defenses. Newport Bridge, spanning the Saigon River on Highway 1, was the last the communists had to cross to enter the capital. We didn't know it then, but this was the last fight.
There's no way of shifting these people. 500 or 600 troops on this bridge, fighting probably a dozen or so, maybe 20 at the most, communists, and yet there they are, they've been there all today. One moment they panicked, and rightly so. The mortar hit right in the middle of them down on the right, 100 yards away. It killed a lot of people. But now they've gone back to some of their positions. They've left one wounded in the road. Got this, and dead on the right.
They held the bridge a few more hours, but everyone knew this was the end. Saigon was about to fall. Soon the war would be over. As they pulled back, they brought with them a wounded Viet Cong, a young woman commando they had been fighting. Now the enemy, soon the victor. American embassy officials had promised an orderly evacuation for their own people, the foreign press, and for all those Vietnamese who had worked for them and might be in danger. The plan was for a helicopter evacuation from the embassy grounds, and the signal was Bing Crosby singing White Christmas over Radio Saigon. But somebody forgot to play it, and the embassy was stormed. So people fought and clawed their way over that wall, and they did fight and they did claw. The hysteria was infectious. From midday to past midnight, a constant shuttle of naval helicopters from the American 7th Fleet airlifted out of that embassy more than 5,000 people. The ambassador went on the final helicopter from the platform above his office. He was the last American to leave Vietnam. Aboard the U.S. carriers waiting off the coast in the South China Sea, helicopters were arriving that did not belong to any ship of the fleet. South Vietnamese pilots had commandeered them and had flown themselves and their families out from right under the noses of the Communist Army. They joined the ranks of refugees aboard, but there was no room for their machines on deck, and so millions of dollars worth of helicopters were simply pushed overboard. The North Vietnamese army entered Saigon just as they'd planned on May Day. Their journey had taken over 30 years, 10,000 days.
and those of the world's press left behind in the city witnessed the triumphant arrival.
This is a historic moment, the arrival of the North Vietnamese Regular Army in Saigon, right in the middle of Saigon, just after 12 o'clock, just after noon. Here they are pouring down the main avenue. Further up there is the American Embassy. At this end of the avenue is the former presidential palace, which President Chu left just over a week ago, and from which General Min has today announced that he will unconditionally hand over to the new regime.
Their tanks had thundered down the length of Vietnam all the way from Hanoi. Now they crossed Saigon's boulevards, and their foot-weary infantry plodded past the deserted military barracks. The people did not know whether they should cheer or weep, and they had yet to discover who was friend and who was foe. They had expected a bloodbath, but not a shot was fired that day and not a drop of blood spilt. The communist flag flew over a Saigon renamed. To honor the man whose prophecies had led them here and who had died before he saw them come true, they called it Ho Chi Minh City. South Vietnam, such a short-lived nation, was finally toppled.
Foreign policy does shift back to anti-communism in 1979 after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Afghanistan had traditionally been within the Soviet orbit, but after years of political instability, the USSR is going to invade at the nominal request of the government to, quote, maintain order. Now, fighting the Soviets were many groups, among them the American-backed Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were foreign fighters who wished to wage jihad against atheist communism. One member of the Mujahideen was Osama bin Laden, the person who masterminded the attacks on New York and the Pentagon on 9/11. So we kind of have a history there. The Soviets would ultimately back down in Afghanistan for 9 years before finally leaving in February of 1989 under Mikhail Gorbachev. And then a few years later, America said, hold my beer, and went in even longer. Carter's administration was racked with domestic economic problems as well as international crises. In addition to Saigon and Afghanistan, the Arab states are going to issue an oil embargo against the United States for the U.S. support of Israel. And so we basically run out of oil for a time, and there are, rationing of gas, and gas stations ran out of gas, and there'd be lines around the block. We also had economic problems, specifically stagflation. Stagflation is when there is high interest rates, low growth, and inflation. And, of course, after the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown, Americans were taken hostage in Iran and held hostage for over a year. So all of these things put together means that the country was again ripe for change and ready to swing in the other direction. And so in the election of 1980, the United States will elect the Republican Ronald Reagan. So in this lecture, we analyzed the causes of the war in Vietnam and American goals in the war. We analyzed American conduct and strategy in the Vietnam War. We discussed how and why the Vietnam War ended. We analyzed the politics of the 1970s, and we compared and contrasted Watergate to the impeachment of Donald J. Trump.